Before the battle, after taking Fort Donelson, the Union Army of West Tennessee advanced toward Corinth, Mississippi, where the Confederates were planning to strike back. The road to Shiloh. On March 4th, 1862, the victor at Fort Donelson, Ulysses S. Grant, was relieved of his command by Henry W. Halleck for alleged neglect and inefficiency. The decision was reversed under the pressure from President. By early April, Grant was back to command at Pittsburgh Landing on the west bank of Tennessee. Halleck ordered Don Carlos Buell to march his army up Ohio to join Grant's 6 divisions. On April 6, the Confederates attacked, achieving almost total surprise. The brunt of the onslaught was borne by 2 previously unblooded divisions under General William T. Sherman and Benjamin M. Prentiss. Their hastily improvised response ought the Union forces time and averted rout. Grant arrived from Savannah on a steamboat around 8:30 a.m. and found the position on 6-mile-wide battlefield desperate. Many raw troops had fled the battle, cowering along the riverbank, leaving Sherman in control of the Union. The defense on the right flank. Grant ordered Prentiss to hold the line on the center in a position that would become known as the Hornet's Nest. After the battle. In the Battle of Shiloh, the Union almost lost over 13,000 men, casualties and prisoners, while the Confederates had fewer than 11,000 losses. It took time for the reality of the Confederates' defeat to be acknowledged. Ulysses S. Grant came under severe criticism in Northern press, with reports exaggerating the unpreparedness of the Union troops. More on Shiloh. On the morning of April 6, 1862, 40,000 Confederate soldiers under the command of Gen. Albert Sidney Johnston poured out of the nearby woods, struck a line of Union soldiers, occupying ground near Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. The overpowering Confederate offensive drove the unprepared Federal forces from their camps and threatened to overwhelm Ulysses S. Grant's entire command.
Battle of New Orleans. The Southern military generals planned for a Union attack down the Mississippi, not from the Gulf of Mexico. On April 24th of 1862, Union Navy forces sought to capture the city during the American Civil War. The Union's navy consisted of 43 ships under Admiral David G. Farragut. Entered the lower Mississippi near New Orleans, and soon breached the heavy chain cables that were stretched across the river as a prime defense. Realizing that resistance was useless, Confederate General Mansfield Lovell withdrew his 3,000 troops northward, and the city fell on April 25th. On May 1st, General B.F. Butler led 15,000 Union troops into the city to take command for the remainder of the war. The permanent loss of New Orleans was considered one of the worst disasters suffered by the Confederacy in the Western theater of the war. Union captures New Orleans. The capture of this important southern city was a huge loss to the Confederacy. In early 1862, the Confederates concentrated their forces in northern Mississippi and western Tennessee to hold off the Yankee invasion. Many of these troops fought at Shiloh in Tennessee on April 6th and 7th. 8 rebel gunboats were dismissed up the Great River to stop a Union flotilla above Memphis, leaving only 3,000 militia, 2 uncompleted ironclads, and a few steamboats to defend New Orleans. The most difficult obstacles for the Union were 2 forts, Jackson and St. Philip. In the middle of the night on April 24th, Admiral David Fragate led a fleet of 24 gunboats, 19 mortar boats, and 15,000 soldiers in a brave run past the forts. The Battle of Ironclads, or the Battle of Hampton Roads, was the most important naval battle of the Civil War. The South launched the first ironclad in 1859. They selected James B. Eads to design the boat. He was an inventor and engineer. The boat had 13 cannons. These boats skimmed above the water with heavy protection. The tops of these boats looked like flat top pyramids. This design allowed it to carry weapons and to navigate easily. These ships took tons of work. They were 145 feet in length and 50 feet wide. Battle of the Ironclad. The Battle of Hampton Roads. The Confederacy Navy addition of iron plates to the captured USS Merrimack steam freight temporarily made an unstoppable force in undisputed waters of the Civil War. After seeing the Merrimack in action, the Union Navy constructed its own ironclad, the USS Monitor. On March 8th of 1862, the world's first battle between 2 ironclad warships took place in confined waters of Hampton Roads, Virginia. Virginia attacked a Union squadron of wooden hull vessels in Hampton Roads. The USS Congress, a frigate, and the USS Cumberland, a sailing sloop, were easily sunk by the Virginia, which suffered no noticeable damage. Late that night, the USS Monitor arrived in the area. With its deck nearly at water level, the Monitor had an unassuming appearance, but it was a formidable match for the Confederate ironclad. The North's vessel was technically far superior than the Confederates' counterparts, as the North could construct their ships entirely in their own shipyard, while the South could basically do little more than converting exile hulls into ironclad figures, or construct floating armored battery boxes. More on ironclad. The previous day, the Confederate ironclad, the CSS Merrimack, officially the CSS Virginia, impervious to her enemy's guns, it had sunk 2 Union warships. When she re-emerged from Norfolk to complete the destruction of the Union blockade squadron, the USS Monitor steamed out to meet her. The 4-hour duel that ensued was a stalemate, but crucially the Virginia had failed to break the northern blockade of the southern ports. In a single battle, these 2 ironclad rendered wooden warships obsolete and transformed the face of the naval warfare forever. There are full-color comic books, including further reading essentials, information on the background and aftermath, and key players of the conflict, illustrating one of the most revolutionary naval battles in the world, and transports the reader to the cramped and dangerous conditions that the sailors faced for the first time.
North had a major advantage in population. They had 23 states in the Union, while the South only had 11. Since the North was industrialized, it was better prepared for war than the agricultural economy in the South. The industry was fueled by more abundant natural resources than in the South, and many large cities were established. New York was the largest city with more than 1,800,000 inhabitants. Factories hired immigrants to manufacture more arms, ammunition, medical supplies, and uniforms than the South could. The North contained most of the nation's resources, such as coal and iron. Also, the North had twice the density of railroad networks to transport supplies and soldiers than the South. The North had a navy, which the South didn't, so the North could easily set up a blockade to cut off Southern trade. North had an established government with a strong leader, Abraham Lincoln, while the South was just setting up their government. Northern children were slightly more prone to attend school than Southern children. Far more Northerners than Southerners belonged to the Whig and Republican Party, and they were far more likely to have careers in business, medicine, or education. The North had a population of 22 million well-educated and hard-working people.
To the North, preserving the Union was not worth killing and dying for, so that gave the South a psychological advantage. The South was fighting for survival. The South only consisted of 9 million people, and 3.5 of that was slaves. So the South slaves rough challenges forming an army. The South had strategic advantages and simply had to avoid defeat, expecting that in time the North would give up. There was weak leadership skills of Jefferson Davis. Also, there was no navy for the South to protect themselves. The South could easily supply troops with food, but transporting goods and soldiers was a major problem. There were fewer men, fewer supplies, which meant less factories, which meant that they had less money, and then lastly, they had a weaker government. For South's uniforms, volunteers wore dark blue jackets and kepis, which are military hats, with light blue trousers. Non-volunteers wore gray kepis, jackets, and trousers, weathered and faded, had a light brownish appearance, named the butternuts. The fertile soil and warm climate of the South made it ideal for large-scale farms and crops like tobacco and cotton. Because agriculture was so profitable, few Southerners saw a need for industrial development. 80% of the labor force worked on the farm. Although 2/3 of Southerners earned no slaves at all. By 1860, the South's particular institution was inextricably tied to the region's economy and culture. In fact, there were almost as many blacks, but slaves and free, in the South as there were whites. 4 million blacks and 5.5 million whites. There were no large cities aside from New Orleans, and most of the ones that didn't exist were located on rivers and coasts as shipping ports to send agricultural produce to European and northern destinations.
Okay, we're good. No, I'll just crop